Hi, Elliot.
So, starting the presentation now. Okay, so it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Mason Porter. Professor Mason Porter is, now I'll tell you a little bit about it. As you can see, he's a professor in the Department of Mathematics and in the Department of Sociology at UCLA, and also a member of the Santa Fe Institute. He has many awards and is recognized as a researcher in applied mathematics and many other fields. In particular, he's an elected fellow of the American Physical Society, of the American Mathematical Society. He has been at Caltech, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Applied Mathematics. He did his graduate studies in Applied Mathematics at Cornell, and where he worked on quantum billiards. He was supervised there by Richard Leboff and graduated in 2002. Subsequently, Professor Porter has been at Georgia Tech, at the Mathematical MSRI, now changed name, but in Berkeley. He was again at the Caltech, I believe. Then he has been in Oxford for about 10 years. Then he moved back home, I would say, to UCLA. And he's an expert in many fields, in particular networks, dynamical systems, topological data analysis, and lots of other things. In 2014, he won the Erdo Shirini Prize for his work on networks. In 2015, he was awarded the Whitehead Prize by LMS, and in 2016, he was awarded the Young Scientist Award for Social and Econophysics. In 2019, he became CM Fellow for his contribution to diverse problems, application networks, complex system, and nonlinear system. So it's a great pleasure for us to have Professor Porter here. So, and without further ado, I will give him the opportunity to present his work.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much for having me. So what I'd like to do is to kind of give an introduction to topological data analysis and then survey some things that my collaborators and I have done in the context of spatial systems. And the main thing I want you to get out of this is kind of more the introduction part rather than the specific things we've done, but hopefully that will help illustrate some of these ideas. Okay, so foundationally, mathematically, we're going to use some ideas from topology. So this will underpin these sorts of efforts. And I'm going to need to explain what it means to do topology of data, right? This may seem, if you have not looked at TDA, topological data analysis before, this may seem a little bit counterintuitive because topology is really thinking about continuous systems. So somehow, or smooth systems. So somehow you want to make some sense of what it means, right? So that's going to, we're going to build up to that. If you look at Wikipedia, or at least when I looked at Wikipedia a few months ago, part of the entry looked like this. I haven't checked to see if anyone's changed that part, but so topology is concerned with properties of some object, and you're preserving them under some change that you're allowed to make. So you're allowed to deform it in some way, so stretch it perhaps, bending it, but what you're not allowed to do is you're not allowed to close holes. You can't change the number of holes. You can't tear or glue anything, right? So there's certain things that you're allowed to do. And a question then is, well, what is invariant under those things that you're allowed to do? So of course, the classical version of this is that a topologist cannot tell the difference between a donut and a coffee cup. There is a video that you can look at from Henry Segerman and Keenan Crane. Henry Segerman does a lot of mathematics art. Keenan Crane, I believe, is a computational geometer. And you can buy this. This is actually a picture of something. I have not bought it. It comes in different colors and so on. And you can see a coffee cup being deformed into a donut. Although in this case, because these are actual physical objects, there are 7 discrete objects. But you can deform one and the other, and you're preserving this hole. So the hole is over here is the same as the hole that's over there in these deformations that I'm allowed to do. You can get much worse, so topological dreams or nightmares. This is the border between Belgium and the Netherlands at Barl-Nassau if you're in one country, or Barl-Hertog if you're in the other. So imagine, and you can try this, go there and look at the GPS on your car and imagine where's my cursor? Imagine starting down here, roughly in the center, and going straight north. And okay, it's like you're in the Netherlands, then you're in Belgium, then you're in the Netherlands, and you're very briefly in Belgium, then Netherlands, then Belgium, then Netherlands, then Belgium, right? So the GPS is kind of going nuts. So there are situations. This is a bit of an extreme one, to be honest, but there are things like this. If you're dealing with geospatial data, like from postal codes or from other regions of a city, there are various things in there. And I mean, I'm actually even on a paper where, because of certain zip codes in New York that are constructed in a weird way, we actually have special cases of a theorem because of certain parts of New York and how the zip codes are pasted together. So even though the example I'm showing you is extreme, there are things like this that actually show up if you're dealing with geospatial data. Okay, now in particular, from topology, I want to use ideas from algebraic topology. And so we want to have some sort of algebraic things that we're going to measure. And so this is where our invariants are going to come from. So these are going to classify topological spaces. Now here I said up to homeomorphism, so up to the deformations I'm allowed, right? Some numbers that you measure to do this. Okay, so here's this picture again. So we're describing the properties of an object that stay the same if we do certain things. We can stretch it or shrink it or bend it. We can't glue things together. We can't tear things. Okay, so there's certain things we're allowed to do. And so we want these invariants that then are described algebraically. So this could be the number of components. There's one component. It could be the number of holes in certain types of dimensions. This thing here has what is sometimes called a one-dimensional hole. That's the same in all those. It could be the number of holes, like voids, in different dimensions. Imagine a spherical shell and what's inside the sphere. That's not the same as a hole in this donut. And in the context of what we're doing today, we're considering what are called homological invariants. So homology is literally referring to holes. But there are other types of topological invariants as well, and one can imagine coming up with algorithms to deal with data for different types of invariants. Homology has been developed the most, but one can think about others. Okay, so we want to use ideas like this, somehow make sense of it to analyze data, right? And so the main purpose of the talk, and what I want you to get out of it, is somehow how to make sense of it, and then I'll show some examples through work I've been involved in. Okay, so imagine you were given what's called a point cloud. So you have a set of points, say, on a piece of paper. What does it look like? Now, the points that are in this picture, technically I've given them a finite radius, but you're supposed to think of them initially as having not actually any radius at all, but just being points. So humans are good at this, right? We see this creature. This is actually a Pokemon called Jigglypuff, and you may not know that, but even if you don't know that, you see things that look like eyes, and things that look like feet, and things that look like ears, right? Humans are good at doing this, but topologically, we want to make sense of it, and we don't just want to necessarily count the number of points there are, because that's not really telling us what we're trying to see. Okay, so we're trying to make sense of studying the shape of data. And that's what topological data analysis is about. So it gives you algorithmic methods to do this in a systematic manner. And data can come from a variety of different sources. So I showed an example of point clouds, but it could come from images or videos or networks or something else, right? So the source data could be something else. And the most commonly used method in topological data analysis, and the one that I'm spending the most of my time on in this talk, is persistent homology. So this will be a formalism for studying topological invariants, more particularly homological invariants, numbers of holes, components, and so on. There are some good algorithms to do this. And this notion of persistence, right, this is going to be how we're going to cope with noise in data and how we're going to make sense of something topologically. We want notions of having a parameter, maybe more than one parameter, that we change, and certain structures are going to exist across a large range of these parameter values. And there's quite a few applications that people have thought about, some more often than others. For basically, I think, historical accident, there have been quite a few applications in neuroscience, to the point that there are actually a couple of review articles about using topological data analysis specifically in neuroscience. There's been a bunch of work on vascular networks. There's been some work on spreading processes on networks, a good amount of work on networks more generally. There's been quite a bit of work on granular materials, coffee being my favorite one of those, of course. We've done some work on resource coverage and on political islands and city streets and some other things. Okay, so there's quite a bit. This list is biased somewhat towards things that I've spent time on, but there's a lot more than this. Okay, some references. This is a bit of a busy slide, but I wanted to include this reference because this slide because people might be interested. And let me just go one at a time. This first one is actually a paper that some collaborators and I wrote for teenagers and preteens. So if you have a teenager or preteen in your life and you want them to learn about topological data analysis, this is a place to start. And in fact, a couple pictures in this slide deck even come from there. Another very friendly article is one that Chad Topaz wrote for DS Web, which is Siam's Dynamical Systems Web magazine. So this gives an idea of where he came from. Another paper that I was involved in is something, it's actually written for undergraduate physicists, but undergraduate, and so we wrote this for Physics Today. Physics Today is the physics analog of notices of the AMS, if you want to get some idea of who the audience is for. And then the last two are a little more complicated. One of them is one of the review articles for doing TDA in neuroscience, and the reason I'm mentioning this one and not the other is that I like this one better. But I know that neuroscience is much more specific than what we're talking about today. But the reason that I'm including this one is that if you want to see an example of what stuff somebody includes when they're writing a TDA review article for a specific field, maybe that notion of concreteness might be relevant, even if it's other fields that you're thinking about. And then the last one here is another one that I was involved in. And this is meant to be both an introduction to persistent homology and also computation of it, comparing at the time the different resources. Obviously, in 7 years, various algorithms have advanced and so on. So there's certain aspects that are out of date. But it's a good starting point, and it also includes a tutorial for installing and using software for persistent homology. So if you're going to do persistent homology for the first time and want guidance sort of step by step, that's what this article is meant to do. So if you actually want to do some calculations and set things up, it's helpful for that. And I'll be happy to share slides and so on, so you don't need to frantically be copying things down or whatnot. Okay, so to mention a couple of the examples really briefly, so there's various types of resources. One example resource, maybe either less serious than others or more serious depending on your perspective, is the locations of pubs in the UK. One thing I like about this paper, besides the fact they have an interesting example, this is actually an introduction to TDA for people from geographic information sciences, and it's written in one of their journals. Right, so again, it's an example of this is actually written for a non-mathematical audience, and so then the question is, what do they emphasize? So they had this nice example with pubs. Cardiff versus Manchester is shown in this picture. I don't know, maybe we should all go to Manchester, but who knows? Okay, here's an example of vascular networks. This comes from Bernadette Stoltz and others. This is a paper that was in Science Advances. I'm showing this slide. I know there's some complex things in here that I have not explained, mostly just to show you this as an example, but think of data that might look like this. Vascular networks can occur in both animals and plants, and maybe there's some way to say something about it topologically. Given this picture, that seems like at least a reasonable thing to try. And then this particular figure is their sort of pipeline for things that they chose to do. So they chose a certain type of filtration, which I'm not going to define for you, but we will have the notion of a filtration. We'll just be doing it in a different way. They then have some type of summary. I will actually show a barcode later, I think, or I'll show at least some summary, but they have some type of summary that's telling you how the topological information is changing as a function of some parameter, which for them is a radius, but for us will be other things. The notion of persistence comes here. The longer barcodes are the ones that are the features that existed for a larger radius or a larger range of radii. And then it might be that one has topological descriptors that makes a physical or biological sense that comes from this. So this is their pipeline. Others are not exactly the same, but hopefully that gives some idea. granular materials. So this particular one is actually, it's either from my collaborator Karen Daniels' lab or from the lab of her postdoc advisor Bob Behringer. The same systems have gotten used in both labs, so that's why I don't remember which one this picture is from. But there are particles of two different shapes in here, and they can be touching each other, but they can also exert forces on each other. The brighter parts are higher forces, and the question is how to explain those things. So you can do it through network analysis, but you can also do it through topological data analysis. So Danny Bassett's former student Leah Papadopoulos and me and Karen and Danny have a review article on this type of system, and there are sections within that review article. So it's a specific subset of the review article that talks about doing TDA on these types of systems, and there's been quite a bit of work from various people in doing that. This one comes from one of my papers. You can talk about spreading processes on networks and potentially use topological data analysis, in this case, to distinguish between when am I going like a wave around a ring and when am I jumping to a new place. And topologically, the question is going to be, when do I pick up the circle as a sort of structure, and when do I not pick up the circle? You can also look at city-street networks. So this is also from one of my papers. As I said, the examples are biased towards my own work, even though there's tons and tons of other stuff that I'm not involved in. You can perhaps use some topological summaries. This thing in here is called a persistence diagram. I'll define that later. Giving a summary of connected components and one-dimensional holes in this case in the centers of different cities. LA is boring in this respect, but things like Aleppo and Barcelona have much more interesting stuff going on. London has interesting stuff going on, and you can perhaps then do some sort of classification. Okay, so that gave a bit of a whirlwind, but I hope that gives some idea of the types of things that we might try to do, at least for these sorts of examples. I biased the examples towards ones that are in space, especially in low-dimensional space, because that's what I am concerned with in this talk. But you can also do other sorts of things. Okay, so I showed you this picture before. So we squinted this, what does it look like, right? Humans are good at this, but we want an algorithm to do this, and we want to be able to do this systematically, because doing things one by one is not, that's not realistic. Okay, so this is the picture that the point cloud was created from. All right, so you have, whoops, where is this? So there's certain features here and here and here and here, and you see them there as well. Okay, so this came from our article for teens and preteens. And the traditional thing that you do in persistent homology is that you take a point cloud, could be other data, but point cloud's the most common, and you track changes as you change something. In this case, you're taking the radius of the dots and you're making them larger. And for a fixed radius, so A has a fixed radius of these dots. How many components are there? How many holes are there? And then more generally, how many higher dimensional voids and so on are there? B has a fixed radius that's slightly larger. How many components are there? How many holes are there? Same thing with C and D and all the others. And what happens is the number of components will go down. That won't go up the way we've set this up. The number of holes will go up and then will go down, right? So at some point you just get a blob and you can no longer tell what things are. But you want to know what is the minimum radius when a feature first was there, and what is the maximum radius when a feature is no longer, or the last radius before a feature dies. So people talk about features being born and features dying. And so what you do topologically is that panel A, I measure the topology of this thing. I measure the number of connected components and holes on its own. Panel B, I do the same thing, and for each of the other panels. And then you track which ones are born and which ones die. And so the way to make sense of topology and data is that you fix some sort of scale or other parameter that you're measuring. You measure the topology at that parameter, and you ask how things change as a function of the parameter. Okay, so number of components is from a group known as H naught, so it's a homology. The zeroth homology group is going to actually be the size of this group or the rank of this group. Number of 1D holes will be the first homology group. So these are the same pictures here. Okay, we use the word pieces rather than components because we did this for teens and preteens, and we're trying to use language that's not introducing extra words, but you start with a lot in this first figure, and then it goes down. Eventually, it's just one piece, and then the number of holes starts at 0. Humans can fill it out before the topology picks it up, but eventually you get 2. I think it's one of the eyes and one of the ears, if I'm looking at it correctly. And then you get 6 holes as more things close up. Here you also have 6 holes, but notice that 3 of these are now really tiny. And you go from there. Here you have 3 holes. I can't even tell where the third one is. It might be there, but it's really hard to tell. Okay, so what is the point? So you've got algorithmic methods to study potentially high-dimensional data in a quantitative manner. The data, I showed an example with point clouds, just at least a visual example, but it could come from networks or images or videos or time series and so on, right? So you have a data set and you want to take a topological lens of it. This gives some notion of shape. And then I've been in particular focusing on persistent homology, which is what's talking about holes per se, right? So persistent structures. Some of the components were actual features, some of them were not, and you want to figure out which are which. Okay, so a little bit more mathematics to sort of formalize some of this. There's a notion called a simplicial complex. So a K-simplex will be a K-dimensional polytope, and that's going to be the convex hull of its K+1 vertices. So you get a point and an edge and a triangle and a tetrahedron and so on. An M face will be a subset of size m+1 and is itself an M simplex. So a 2 face of the tetrahedron is a triangle. A 1 face of the tetrahedron is an edge. And then a simplicial complex will be the union of all these things subject to 2 requirements. One is that every face is also present. Okay, so this is a downward closure. So if I have this tetrahedron, I have to also have all the triangle faces, and I have to also have all the edges, and I have to also have all the vertices. Okay, so this downward closure is something that's required. And the second one is a non-empty intersection of 2 simplices is a face of both. And so, for example, if there's an edge that intersects, it has to have the entire edge, not only part of it. So if my hand is an edge, I have to have both. I cannot have part. I don't actually have a picture of a non-example right now on these slides. This is a canonical picture from Wikipedia. Notice that this entire edge is there, and that's present in both of these. I cannot have these 2 triangles have only a partial overlap of the edge. It has to either be the entirety, or it has to be a point only, or it has to be nothing. Okay, so we're going to use ideas from algebraic topology to analyze data. All right, so a simplicial complex, one of those things I was showing you, S0 could be a simplicial complex. It could be the one I was showing on a previous slide. S1 could be a different simplicial complex, okay? So each one of these on its own. And the notion of persistence is that I have this nested set of these. This is known as a filtration or a filtered simplicial complex. So we have a sequence, each one contained in the other, like the sort of Russian dolls type of thing. And you can think of each of these SI as looking at a data set at a different scale. And so when I make a statement of there are this many components and this other many holes, that statement is being made about one of these things. So I make that statement separately about S0, S1, and S2, and I want to know when those numbers change and when they stay the same. And the things that I'm going to interpret as features are ones that stay the same across many different ones of these things. Okay, so in other words, they persist across scales or persist across whatever parameter that you're measuring. Okay, this picture is from one of my former students, Abby Hickok. This particular slide, it's showing the same type of thing, but putting the simplicial complex on top of it. Imagine these are points. They're not supposed to actually have a thickness in this context, but we're humans. We draw with a thickness, and so they have radius 0 around them. Now we put some other radius. And any time that 2 of them overlap in their radius, I draw an edge. If 3 of them have all 3 pairwise overlapping, so this is 3 pairwise overlappings, I draw a triangle. If here at a larger radius, at this point I have 4 disks that have pairwise overlap between each pair, so I draw a tetrahedron, right? So at this radius, I only have a set of vertices. At this radius, I still have all the vertices. I can't lose anything because it's nested, but I also have a bunch of edges and some triangles. At this radius, I have more edges and more triangles, and I also have some tetrahedra. And notice that this simplicial complex, this stuff that's in red, there's now a hole here. So at this radius, I have a different value of that particular invariant than I do at that radius. Okay, so the actual topological sequence, these what was called S's on this particular slide, are the simplicial complexes that are built on top of these radii. This has a name. It's known as the Viator-Rips filtration. It's not the only choice, and in fact, one of the things that we found in doing our work is that different ways of constructing simplicial complexes from data are often good. The type I've shown you is distance-based, so this is one of the canonical ones, and if you use software that exists and don't make your own module, this would be one of the standard ways of doing it. You fix a value of epsilon, which is our radius. For each point in a point cloud, you center a ball of radius epsilon on it. Whenever k plus 1 of these epsilon balls all overlap pairwise, we have a k-simplex, and the resulting collection of simplices is a simplicial complex. So this is the union of all the things at these different values. This is sorry, 4 is at one value. Apologies, that's at one value. Then we increment epsilon and do it again, and we keep doing this until we are bored, until we have a giant blob or whatever. Okay, so I commented about birth and death of features. You can define these in a precise way. I'm going to write it here in English, but you can also write it down algebraically. A feature is born in a certain simplicial complex if that's the smallest I for which it exists, so the smallest radius for which something existed. A feature dies if it's the largest I for which it exists. Features can also live forever, right? And then there's various ways of summarizing it. So this is a topological summary. And I'm going to show you persistence diagrams and barcodes. I've actually shown you both, but have not explained them. And there's others that people use as well. And there's different advantages and disadvantages to some of them, and sometimes just personal taste. So this is a barcode. Each interval is a feature in dimension n. So this is zero-dimensional feature, so this is components. And this is one-dimensional feature, so this is 1D holes. And the left endpoint indicates when a feature is born, and the right endpoint indicates when a feature dies. Visually, longer ones are more persistent. Of course, this is subject to how you were measuring things. And there's some epsilon here that actually means something totally different from what I was showing before. But the idea is that you have something that you're doing and you're constructing this filtered simplicial complex. And for each value of epsilon, you are measuring something. And then you're saying, okay, well, counting. How large is the homology group? How many components are there? How many holes are there? And higher dimensional holes, although in our work, we've only really been doing 0 and 1 dimensional. So here's another topological summary, same information. You've got a birth coordinate. This is the value of epsilon at which it was born, minimum radius, say. This is the value of epsilon at which it died. And we're showing both the connected components and the holes, the one-dimensional holes on this plot. So we're showing both, but you can just do one if you want. The diagonal is indicating birth and death at the same time. Whether or not you include that depends on various things, and that's a different discussion. So this feature over here was born at time 6 or value 6 and died, it looks like, at value 8. Right? This one was born later but also died. This line at the top in this part is basically saying this lived forever. So this was a component. There's still one component at the end. And so we're just putting this line essentially to represent infinity in this particular plot. And that will mean either it lives forever, which is what's true in this case, or it could mean we are no longer tracking it, right? So it could just be we're treating it as forever because we're no longer tracking it. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a couple of the examples. So I've done what I viewed as the main part, which was just telling you something about this and giving you some background. So this is some work that I did with my former student, Michelle Fung, that appeared a few years ago. And the idea is to quantify political islands, which again, humans are good at, but can we do this algorithmically? And so we can perhaps detect red voters in a sea of blue. I don't know if maybe this one, kind of, or maybe light blue voters in a sea of dark blue. So it's not just different parties, but also different extremes of a given party. This is Alameda County on the left and Tulare County on the right. So we used data from the Los Angeles Times from a project that they had. You can download this from the LA Times. I don't have the website offhand, but we cite it in our paper. It was from a project from the 2016 election, so that's the data that we have. The fact that it's precinct level is actually pretty rare. That's more finely grained than what one can usually get for public stuff. All right, so each one of these big things is a county. Topological methods seems reasonable that you could identify holes. And we're going to consider these islands as holes in a manifold in which all precincts are voting similarly. Okay, so we defined our own simplicial complexes because Vietoris RIPS will turn out not to work very well. And a reason the one I showed you before is not going to work very well is that it's really very dependent on the size. And if I look here, I don't care about the geographic size of these things. That's not actually what I'm trying to measure. I'm trying to measure how much did it vote for one political candidate versus another, which is a label on the region, but it's different from the physical size of it. And so we wanted to define different ways of constructing these filtered simplicial complexes that would allow us to track, say, how extremely this one voted red. The color looks orange, which was not intentional, but I suppose is a feature rather than a bug. But we want, that's the type of thing that we wanted to track. So the way that we thought would work well, and it does work better than Vietoris RIPS, but didn't work as well as we thought, but it's still in the paper because it partly does. It's sort of one step at a time, right? This did better, but then there's another one that did even better than this. So we used notions of adjacencies to define simplices. So an adjacency would be this precinct is adjacent to this precinct over here because you can go between them. And you can talk about rook versus queen adjacency, defined analogously to how those pieces move in chess. I think we used queen. I'd have to look it up. It's in the paper. But those are choices that people in the geographical information sciences make. So we use these to define simplices. And if all n+1 nodes are pairwise adjacent, then you have an n-simplex. And so given data either on the nodes or on the edges, in this example, it's on the nodes, you can construct a filtration, which is then not determined by distance. And so what the filtration parameter will do is track the strength of preference for a specific candidate, regardless of how large the precinct is. Then there's another one that we did known as the level set Vietoris RIPS complex, or we called it the level set Vietoris RIPS complex. That was less intuitive to us, but actually turns out to work better than the adjacency complex. We use data in surface form, so we're starting from a manifold instead of starting from a point cloud. And then we take maps of all precincts with similar voting patterns, and we consider the outer contour as a zero level set of a 3D object, and then we evolve them using the level set equation, which is a propagation of fronts. And the reason you still have a filtration and have this nestedness is the front is always moving outward. So you have this property of nestedness. I should also say in sort of the context, I'm in the same hallway as Stan Osher, who's well known as kind of having invented this level set stuff or co-invented the level set PDE stuff. And so this also has a sort of UCLA applied math flavor to it, in that there was an expert right here and we knew about these methods, and so it was motivation for us to try these methods. And in this case, the filtration parameter really is time step. And so it's the time step of a PDE or in a PDE. And if you actually compare different versions, the alpha is an approximation of Vietoris RIPS to make it computationally faster, but it's based on distance. If you compare the different ones, what you get are very different things because we constructed them in different ways. And the adjacency one is the one that we actually thought would be the best because of how we defined it. The level set one is the one that, in this case, I'm just showing it visually, actually does the best. So here you have these islands, right? Okay, so this is a 30-page paper and I just gave you a preview of it, but one of the reasons that I wanted to bring it up is because when we're studying a certain problem, when we construct our filtration, we often typically want to say, okay, this is a problem we're studying, how should we do it? We don't want to necessarily do it in the standard way, even though I gave a long introduction to the standard way. We want to think of something that makes sense for the problem we're studying. Okay, so there's an example that's fun that's actually part of the same paper as the city street example. And this is spiders spinning webs under the influence of different chemicals. And the story starts in 1948. There's a Swiss pharmacologist named Peter Witt, and one of his buddies was having trouble sleeping because apparently spiders make noise when they spin webs. I don't really understand that, but he told his buddy, okay, you give drugs to animals. Can you give these spiders some drugs so that they're not spinning their webs at 2 in the morning? And of course, there's a long history of giving different drugs to animals in this and seeing what happens. Okay, but there's more to this. In 1995, there's a very brief NASA tech brief. It's just like, it's literally just like 2 pages. So you can read it in a few minutes. And they gave drugs to spiders in space to see what happened to their webs and measured some statistical properties of it. I'm guessing, though the brief does not say this, that they're trying to find alternatives to mammals for some of their things, but maybe they just wanted to create Spider-Man. And the conclusion from NASA was basically that more toxic chemicals resulted in more deformed spider webs, which makes sense. So here's some examples. So this is a normal spider. This is a spider who's been given caffeine, at which point I'm going to have some coffee. Cheers. This spider's been given marijuana. This one's been given chloral hydrate, which is one of the things, this one's been given speed. This one's been given chloral hydrate, which is one of the things you put in sleeping pills. So this one has some issues. Okay. And you can then use this level set complex to compute persistence diagrams. So you can do this, and you can get persistence diagrams for each of these webs. So great. There's 2 others beyond the ones that I showed you on the previous slide. And you can then cluster them. So one of the things I haven't told you, but people do this when they're trying to take these summaries and put them into, say, as input into machine learning things, is that you can calculate distances between 2 persistence diagrams. So you have a notion of distance. Technically, it's a pseudometric. But you have notions of distance, and then you can do clustering from a distance matrix because you have this notion of distance. And so, okay, you don't normally do clustering on 7 things. That's a little bit silly, right? But you can do this on a larger example. So the city street example we did, this has several hundred, even though I'm not showing you that one. And the drug-free spider, it's on its own. And speed, chloral hydrate, and caffeine go here, and marijuana, peyote, and LSD go there. So, okay, it gives you something. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about another application I've been involved in, and this has to do with resource coverage.
I want to mention one thing that looks like that the example D. Okay, they looks like the street system in Milan.
Ah,
It's not the difference. So what was the thing that you gave to the speed?
This one was speed. This one was speed.
Well,
we didn't do it. Yeah. So we didn't give it to them. So these are images that what we did is that we took this and for us, the initial condition is an image from the spider web. So some of these 7 were from a book by Peter Witt, I think, and some of them were from NASA. And let me see, the NASA ones, I think these 5 are from NASA. So yeah, so speed should be from NASA.
That might have something to do with
maybe.
Or Milan.
Yeah, maybe. But I mean, the thing is, you look to see does the radial structure persist, right? Do you still have a radial structure, and do you still have some notion of regularity in the cross strands, right? So that's why, like the one here under F. F is peyote. You're still getting some of that structure, whereas the one with sleeping pills. Sorry, this is caffeine. Sorry, the one with caffeine. It's also true for the one with sleeping pills. But the one with caffeine, I mean, this doesn't look anything like a normal web, right?
There is another thing that one notices a little bit, that the center is always somehow singular.
Ah,
and so
right.
It looks like
That's
the polar coordinate type of transformation.
Yeah. No, the center is singular, but I suspect that that's because of how. I think you're right. I think it's probably how polar coordinates work, and the reason for it. That's not something we looked into. I mean, this is just a fun example. that we thought, okay, we can digitize this data and use the initial condition as an image, which we're allowed to do, and then just see what happens because it's a fun example.
Got it. Got it.
Okay, so I want to also talk a little bit about one other project, and this one, the final version of it got published a few months ago in SIAM Review. It's with a different set of people, and we were looking at resource coverage, and we're actually, well, I'll talk mostly about a couple things are from this paper, but there's also a current project with a subset of the people on this list that we're using it for a different resource. Okay, so naive approach versus a persistent homology approach. So a naive approach might be to select some distance d and calculate what fraction of people within distance d of some resource. So we're considering a polling site where people vote, but it could also be a DMV location, a park. That's going to be the example that comes up later. And we calculate which locations are within distance d of a site, right? So you're fixing some distance. And in fact, there are actually even some government laws. India has such a law. Joe Biden proposed such a law a couple years ago. I don't know, where it went, but he basically said, okay, everybody has to be within, say, 5 miles of a polling site where they go vote. The thing is, 5 miles in Los Angeles and 5 miles in Helena, Montana are not the same, right? They're not, you want to consider time, not just distance. And you don't really want to say, okay, let's fix only one distance, right? You want something that allows you to change the scale more. And persistent homology is not the only thing that does it, but it's one thing that does it. It can also identify entire zones that are not covered instead of doing it pointwise. Okay, now we want to measure distance in terms of time because for this application, that's actually more appropriate, right? And there's two types of time that we include. There's travel time, so I'm going to somewhere and I'm coming back. But when I go to a polling site, I'm also waiting, right? So I'm going to go there and I'm going to wait and I'm going to vote and I'm going to come back. And in different parts of a city, there's also different modes of transportation that one might take. And so different zip codes, for example, zip codes that are poorer, that might have a smaller fraction of people who have cars, right? So there's also this heterogeneity in which types of transportation people can take. Okay. There's also there's a whole thing with what data was actually available to us in practice and what we could get from other people, and that's another big story. But the way that waiting time will work, I mean, I'll suppress the story about the data type part of it. The way that waiting time works is that if my waiting time is an hour, when I take this disk from this Via Torus Rips complex that I was expanding about a point, it means that I will not expand that point until an hour has passed. And so the point stays at a point and then an hour passes. And if the waiting time somewhere else is 5 hours, hope not, but if it is, I wait 5 hours before I expand the point. Okay, so this will be a weighted version of these filtrations that I showed you before, that the point only starts expanding after you've waited that amount of time. After doing a bunch of stuff, I'm showing you one of the summary pictures here. This is comparing Atlanta to Chicago. We actually compared 6 different cities. Atlanta was the city that motivated us because of a lot of the discussions that Stacey Abrams was having about that being difficult to vote there, especially people in rural areas or areas with certain demographics. So Atlanta was kind of our motivational starting point, and then we picked some other cities that were different in various ways. So what we're showing here is an empirical probability distribution, and the horizontal axis is the death time. And what the death time means is that this is how long it takes if you live in a certain area to be able to vote, or really the sort of maximum of it. So differently from other applications, we don't really care what the birth time is. We actually only really care about the death time. So which topological summary is relevant is also affected by what matters for the application. We care how long it takes before we can vote. And if we look at how these empirical probability distributions are relative to each other, you can see that Atlanta is shifted much to the right of Chicago, both for the zero-dimensional homology classes, which will be saying gaps between, say, two plate locations, and the 1D homology classes, which will be sort of a triangular type of gap, so gap between more like an actual 1D hole. And so Atlanta is shifted quite a bit to the right compared to Chicago, right? And so this summary plot's sort of saying on average, and then you can get more particular, Atlanta has more places where it takes longer to vote by quite a bit than Chicago. And you can put some at least rough numbers on it. Something that we're working on right now, so we don't have a preprint yet, but we're assembling it. So this is with a different set of folks, and we're using parks in Chicago. And the reason we're using Chicago in this case, Chicago's website, their civic website, has a lot more data readily available in really good form than is true for most cities. So it's not that we have any particular interest in Chicago in its own right. But rather it's been a convenient source of data. Now the notion of a park, actually there's a picture that Sarah Tomachko was showing in some of her slides recently, which was really illustrating the point of not all parks are created equal. Different parks have different qualities, right? So this is now a different thing from the voting sites. We now want to have a scalar score attached to each park. So that's one difference between this application and the prior one. And so we're doing a couple things differently mathematically as a result of that. So you might care about stars on a website that someone gives it, or you might care about special features, or you might only care about how large it is or whatever it is. So different people might have different things, but the approach will work regardless of which one. So you imagine you get a map for each approach you use, and so then the question is, how far are you in terms of travel time from a given park? Here we also don't have waiting time, because instead of waiting time being a nuisance, we are supposing that while you're in the park, you probably want to spend time there, right? So again, a different choice because of the context. Okay, so that one, stay tuned. We have to finish the paper. And then for conclusions, so topological data analysis, which I've illustrated through persistent homology, can give insights into structures and dynamics in spatial systems. So I hope I've succeeded in doing that. Persistent homology of spatial and spatial temporal data is something that I've spent a bunch of time on across a series of papers with various students and other collaborators. When you're looking at low dimensional data, this is low dimensional of the ambient space. That's not the same as a dimension of the topological object. We can do systematic comparisons a little bit more, because there's basically some fewer things that can happen. There's still a lot that can happen, but there's less, and so this allows us to make sense of some of these things and be a bit more systematic. The computation time gets very long when you have higher dimensional features. That actually scales pretty badly. And then the other thing that we've spent time doing, which I think is not always done in the literature, is that we've been trying, and this is where sort of my training as an applied mathematician comes in, we've been trying to incorporate information from applications into our approaches. And so the mathematical constructions have been influenced very heavily by the specific systems that we're studying and the questions that we're asking about those systems. And so instead of just automatically doing sort of filtration that's in a software like via Torus RIPS, we've been constructing these objects through something that connects to the application and then analyzing them. All right, so that's what I wanted to say. So let me know if you have any questions. I see a person's mouth moving but no sound.
Yeah, I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. You mentioned some of the applications and how, like, I guess in the past or right now, they're very heavy when it comes to like neuroscience. These applications and stuff that you and your collaborators are investigating, is it sort of like this new thing to, I mean, you're working on it and it's yielding results, so I guess obviously it is, but like this topological data analysis, I'm like, is this something that like people are really looking into right now, or you mentioned like a lot of this stuff has like a geographic context, but like other applications for topological data analysis?
Okay, I'm not sure if I understand your question, but let me see. So we've been looking at spatial systems and social systems, and up to this point, for instance, there have not been that many other groups that have been looking at social systems. There is some more now. There's been a couple papers that have been posted on arXiv. So there, one paper that another group posted. So this Lori Ziegelmeyer and her collaborators posted this about segregation. So there's sort of an intuition that some of these things notions of holes in coverage are very intuitive, right? Like people care about those, and there's a question of how much these methods can help. So there's a notion of intuition that it might be reasonable, but where we are right now is saying, okay, well, is that actually better than doing it some other way, right? And having a definitive answer to that question is a lot less clear. So what we're trying to do is to say, all right, let's try to do it and see how well we do. The reason I made the comment about neuroscience is that I don't think it's more appropriate for neuroscience than others per se. It's more like historical accident in the sense that some of the people in applications were interested in neuroscience and then happened to be applications that they like. And so therefore, since they knew these methods, they were trying them on those methods. So I really feel like that's a property of a small set of individuals rather than any statement of, oh, it's especially appropriate for this one. The granular materials and the vascular type things have actually, those have done very well in terms of giving insights. Like those have, so there's actually quite a few of those. It's just that not as much as in neuroscience because it didn't have the historical accident.
Yeah, that makes sense. That answers my question. I was sort of just wondering like where the strengths are or like what's still in progress or where the weaknesses are, and that sums
Oh,
it up. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Other questions? Well, I have one question, right? So one of the things is, so you talk about spatial problems, right? Is it a little bit ad hoc, the version of these methods when you include time? So what I'm trying to say is that, when you expand a system which depends on time and space, well, sometimes you can expand the space in one way, then you expand time in another way, and then you combine
Okay.
things.
Okay.
Yeah, but is there something which is intrinsic? Because of course, when there are spatial temporal systems, there is a relationship between all the components involved, right? So yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I can comment a little bit. I don't think there's been a huge amount investigating how to really do that. The threads that I know of, there's a lot of work on doing time series analysis. This would be in the context, say, of a dynamical system or a stochastic process. And what these people have often done in those cases is sometimes take a single time series and try to analyze the single time series. The other thing you can do is to do coupled time series, and people have done things like, there's one or two papers that have done stuff with symbolic dynamics. Now, more particularly to applications, I do have one paper that I didn't talk about that does have spatiotemporal things, and what we did is the following. This was looking at COVID case rate data as a function of space and time. So space would be, say, regions of something. I think it may not have been zip codes. It may have been a different region, but certain regions, and time used a weekly gradation because of the time scales of how the data is collected and time scales of COVID as a disease. And what you do there is that at each point in time, or a way to do this is the way we did this. Is not the only way, and I don't know if other ways have been pursued. But a way to do this is to say, you have a persistence diagram at each point in time. You can then have multiple points in time by creating what's called a vineyard. So the paper where we do this, so Abigail Hickok's the first author, and it also has Deanna Needell and me, and we published it in SIAM Math of Data Science 2022. So this was not one of the papers that I showed today. And so vineyards are a way to construct basically a sort of sequence of persistence diagrams and turn it into an object then that would have both space and time. But there's a number of issues. One is that there's other ways that one could do it, and this is the way we did it. So this was a geospatiotemporal example. The other is that this freezes time and then adds it in rather than having time and space sort of fully coupled together, as it were, right? And of course, in real life, time and space are fully coupled together. You're not actually freezing time and doing, putting snapshots together. So it's not solving the full problem by any means. I don't know of another example besides our paper that's actually tried doing space and time for a real system in these ways and trying to get at it. So this is something that, well, we tried it one way and there's a lot more to do.
So
But yeah,
let me say something random about what I had in mind. Like to me, one of the super basic things, for example, in differential equations is doing separation of variables. Now, is there some sort of separation of variables version here, where the X component is the topological part and 10 components on the
Right.
F?
I've never seen anyone try to do that. I mean, essentially, we force a separation of variables by saying we're going to treat each time independently and then piece it together.
But if there is, once there is some sort of nonlinear component, nonlinear interaction, then it's a little bit unclear.
No,
right?
I understand, but I've never seen anybody ever actually try to do it. So you're right, but I don't know how to do it, and as far as I know, neither does anyone else.
Got it. Got it.
So you're right, but you know, I can. We made one attempt. We made the one attempt that I mentioned. There's more work to do.
Awesome.
I see a question
Yes.
in the text. I'm not sure how easily I can answer it because I mean it's a very good question, but it's a very general question. And the idea is how do you make connections between math and applications, and how do you find some problem that's amenable? I mean, like this is basically like my whole career, right? Like I'm trained as an applied mathematician, so this is always what I'm trying to do. And you know, there's some notion of trial and error, but you also build up intuition. So it's a very good question, but I feel like this is like an hour long answer to give a real answer to it, to be honest.
Awesome. Other questions from class audience, in room audience? Anybody online? Well, if not, let's thank Professor Porter for a great presentation, for also your insight, and for the time dedicated to this talk. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. All right.
Yeah, our great pleasure. Our great pleasure.
Yep.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye. So I'm gonna close the recording now.